All right, what's up, everyone? We are finally back for another online Ekkolapto Polymath Salon. It's been a minute since we did the last one after that over a month of touring across North America with the events that we did in person. Some of those events include some of our guests who are here on the podcast on the salon today. Real quick, if everybody wants to give a quick intro, Michael, you first.
I'm a PhD physics student at FAU. My advisor is Dr. William Hahn over there. I mainly specialize in general relativity and complex systems.
Nicholas, quick, your name and what you're working on.
I'm Nicholas. I am currently working at SCC laboratory at UF for robot dynamics. I've done some previous work here. I'm a high school student, just having a fun time.
Elle, if you want to give a quick intro.
Yeah, I'm an artist and researcher. I'm working on computational art in the role of sort of embodied epistemology in and the types of insights that we can generate from actually doing computation manually.
And then finally, Professor William Hahn.
Awesome. Good to see you, Addy. Well, I guess in this hat, I'm someone who loves science fiction. So I'm going to be talking today about science and science fiction. But my other professional hats, researcher into artificial intelligence and complex systems for about 2 decades.
Yeah, you've been at this for a minute, haven't you? You've been at this for a while. And I know that wherever we've taken you, everyone always kind of walks away impressed with how much you know about. And not just how much you know about, but the way you're able to connect things as well. Which is, in some cases, that's even more important. Which is a good also segue into the topic of today, which is this kind of idea that can fiction actually allow you to access more interesting parts of truth and nonfiction? Can fiction be a productive pathway to nonfiction? And I think there's some philosophical and cognitive science things that are interesting in the fact that we can think of things that are technically not possible or perceived to be possible. This is, the whole unthinkable thoughts kind of thing. Thoughts are doing the thinking. I'm sure Dr. Hahn will have an immense amount to go on about that. But in my case, I've been for a long time. I've sort of said that I'm kind of in that interesting limbo, that category where maybe too artsy for the science people, too sciencey for the artsy people, and sort of I had this weird kind of third door. And a lot of the reasons that I was interested in the arts and stuff like that was not just because, okay, I thought it was interesting to tell a story or to make a good drawing or painting or a song. I mean, sure, I love that stuff, right? Lots of people do. But what I thought was even just more interesting, that was worth probing deeper, is that there's something about the way, as the kinds of minds and observers that we are, that we're able to stitch together continuity, right? There's spatial continuity, and then there's temporal continuity. I think when you generally have, like, say, a single image frame, which could be just a still of a film, a still photo, painting, drawing, whatever, is you have a spatial continuity, and you can start to draw conclusions, let's say potentially even non-fictional or fictional conclusions from that information that you're getting. But it starts to get more interesting when you get nonlinear with the visuals and then nonlinear with time, right? So, there's plenty of famous writers and directors that will play with nonlinear formats of conveying a story and a narrative, right? It's nonlinear continuity, right? So Christopher Nolan, in recent years, I actually really like Tenet. Some people didn't like it, but I actually really, really like Tenet for many, many reasons that I'll maybe get into later. But what I thought was interesting is that you have a mix of different perceptions of different points of time, and then they're all kind of finding a way to coincide. And if you actually sit and think about how would two different agents across different directions of time, how they'd interact, that's actually kind of trippy to really think about that in detail and nuance. That's actually a very fascinating thought experiment. But even, many, many years ago, back in 2000, Chris Nolan did it with Memento. There's other independent filmmakers or people who are not necessarily in the mainstream that have tackled even more nonlinear formats of storytelling, especially in the history of literature. And again, what I want to say is kind of interesting is the fact that you can get continuity out of something that is nonlinear. And I think there's something that happens. People will say that, entering a psychedelic state or a meditative state or a dream state lets you tap into a different area of let's say problem solving or potential. So it's sort of like how Professor Barinholtz, Alain Barinholtz, will talk about the latent space, or Michael Levin will talk about platonic spaces. Whatever words you want to use to kind of express a very similar idea, is what's happening is you kind of have this unbounded space of something, right, of potential and whatever. And by having a certain kind of tool or measurement system or mind, you're able to generate an output or a conclusion from that. All right, so if you want to tap into this space that we call visual information, you have to literally have a specific kind of geometry to tap into that. And what we do is we call that our eyes, right, in our brains and their relationship with each other. But let's just say the eyes is the opticals. Like if you change the shape of the eyes, you're no longer tapping into that same thing in the same way. Maybe you're tapping into a different side of the visual spectrum that may not be useful for our physiology and the way our biology kind of functions. But you can literally just mess with the shape of an eye and all of a sudden it taps into something very different. That's the same thing that our ears and our olfactory system and taste and all these different senses are doing, is that by literally being shaped and constrained a certain way, they're constraining that space, that latent space, and tapping into that, right? And it's the same thing where it's like I say that if you what you see is what you get. If you measure in inches, you're going to get inches, kind of thing. And so if you operate under the interface of a certain language or tool set, you're going to get something that's represented through that a lot of the time. But what I think fiction does is it's this very interesting sensory cognitive interface into those platonic spaces. Is just how people say you're able to more easily and efficiently let loose of a number of constraints in the psychedelic, mindset or the meditative mindset or whatever, is that just thinking about writing a fictional story already lets you do that. Is all of a sudden now you can suspend a whole bunch of things that you normally consider to be constraints, and you can get access and tap into something that you normally just wouldn't think about because you write it off as fiction. And I guess the big conclusion that I'm getting at here is that thinking fictionally can actually be a very creative and a potentially productive way of creating something non-fictional. And I know Dr. Hahn has things to say about the way we engineer practical effects in films and all that kind of stuff and what that may actually lead to, if you want to take over the mic real quick.
Sure. Yeah, I've actually put some slides together. If you want, we can jump into that.
Oh, hell yeah. Let's do that.
We can use that to kick off the discussion.
Perfect. Now, was that William Hahn or William Hall or William Hahn.ai that put together the slides?
No, these are slides I put together.
Okay, they're human slides.
I'm very excited for when there's an AI that can kind of accurately and easily do the slides, but I haven't seen one that can do that. They can make really nice graphics, but in terms of laying them out.
Right.
Yeah, so these are just some ideas that I wanted to share to kind of kick off the discussion, but of course I really kind of want to make it more interactive.
I like you put the fiction in parentheses.
Yeah, because I think, in every lie there's some truth, and in every science fiction or every piece of fiction in general, in that sort of lie, I think there's also going to be a lot of truths. And I think that's what I just wanted to kind of talk today. I wanted to get people's ideas of what their favorite science fiction were, and maybe some ideas that they had encountered in science fiction that inspired them to study this stuff you guys study. And so if you're not watching this live, you can also just put these into the chat. We'd love to hear from you guys. So I came across this, I always like to go back to the beginning of, and then kind of build up from there. And I found this amazing book, really from the 2nd century. And it's considered one of the first science fiction stories. And it talks about outer space and aliens and, warfare and the stars and all that kind of stuff. But what's really interesting to me about it is it has this kind of, cheeky kind of attitude where it just says in the beginning it's a true story. And then in the very beginning, it says that it's not true at all and everything is a complete and utter lie. And one of the commentators, he says in there's going to be a sequel, and one of the commentators says that was the biggest lie of all. But this idea that science fiction from the very beginning had this kind of satire, tongue-in-cheek, like, yeah, sure, it's fake if you need it to be, and it's real if you need it to be, and that you can kind of have these dual readings of these interesting texts. And so that's what I've been trying to do, is to go back and watch my favorite ones, or just the stories that really inspired me, and think, what ideas could I get from that? What ideas are in there that are ripe for developing right now, that I think are good kind of, let's say, market opportunities or good research opportunities for young people. Even the stuff that we see a lot of times in what you might call the comic book movies, these things are going to be real sooner than later. So I want to give some examples of how we were kind of able to predict or not predict that. And so one of the, obviously the most influential pieces of science fiction in the last 100 years was Star Trek. And they famously invented this flip phone. And what was really interesting is the show was supposed to take place 300 years into the future. And sadly, the show was only on the air for 3 seasons and ended in 1970. And just 3 short years after that, we saw the first mobile phone use, kind of in the commercial sense. The police had radios in the trunk of their car since the 30s. So this idea of having a mobile phone wasn't new, but I guess the idea that it was, really handheld and small, one little piece. But the interesting thing here is that, at least in the show, we're supposed to believe this is 300 years into the future, when in reality it was only 3 years into the future. So that's off by a factor of 100 in our ability to accurately predict things that are sort of real versus things that are in kind of the science fiction realm. And I wonder what other kind of stuff in the shows we watch now might only be 3 years ahead. There could be other scenarios for why you would see this thing on TV and call it 300 years in the head. Maybe you don't want people to have this. Maybe in some sense you'd rather have either some sort of corporate monopoly kind of motivation, or some other reasons where you think, I don't want people to build their own, so let's make them think it's 300 years into the future. Or it's just that people often are not that optimistic. One of the most interesting examples was the New York Times in, I think, 1902 tried to forecast what they called at the time heavier than air flight. So what we call an airplane, but at the time sort of not a blimp is what they meant. And they said that it might take 1 million to 10 million years to create a flying machine. Well, it was later that summer, right? It was in 2003. And so they put that article, I think, either out in late 1902 or early 1903. And it was just literally months later that the airplane took flight. There's another example that I really like, from Star Wars, where we had sort of this walking kind of elephant type thing that was pretty famous in the second installation, episode 4, if you will, and or rather 5, no, episode 5. And then what was interesting is this was supposed to take place a very, very long time ago, or somewhere far, far away. But GE had already created a walking truck in 1965. And I didn't hear about this thing growing up. I didn't see it. I still don't hear anybody talking about it on YouTube or anywhere else. And that just really surprises me. But, if you zoom in on it, it does say U.S. Army on it. So I call these things victims of their own success. That when you get technology that works like this, it doesn't necessarily make it into the public sphere. It'll get wrapped up and used, or just sometimes shelved for decades, which is kind of quite disappointing. And so you kind of have this retro futurism where this still feels like it's ahead of what I know about the world, but yet is somehow our grandparents' era. I like this as an example of punk computer that nobody really ever heard of. And it's kind of too old to be taught in any computer science or engineering course. And it's way too new, way too young to have been covered in any kind of history. And so it's likely that most people have never seen it before.
UCLA's cyclotron is its new differential analyzer. This amazing mechanical brain quickly solves mathematical problems that would require months by ordinary computing methods. The brain is becoming an invaluable aid in our aircraft capital, speeding engineering research and reducing time spent on flight tests. It is also available for solutions.
So I'm sure a lot of you remember going through, or are now, difficult differential equations like this, where you have very complex systems. And a lot of times it's not possible to get an analytical solution. And here we have a machine. It's essentially, it's an elaborate clock that can calculate this kind of really sophisticated mathematics. This seems like science fiction to me. I think I'm watching some kind of like 50s sci-fi, because I didn't learn, it's not that I didn't learn about this machine, I didn't learn about this concept in school. It wasn't until much later that I developed a passion for the history of technology that I had to, on my own, go back. And so it's this weird retro future where, again, it feels like something that should be ahead of us, something only now you would see on the news or something, that using just metal and gears, we've built a computer that can solve sophisticated math problems. That sounds like the kind of announcements that we hear about with ChatGPT and so on. But here, this is 1948, and we have a machine that's just made out of metal that in today's kind of machinery and stuff, you could probably make for, you know, a few $100s. I'm sure at the time it was much more expensive, but now you could reproduce this quite easily. It's just motors and metal. And we don't teach this. It's not in any classroom. It's not in any school at any level. And I think we should be teaching this, one, because it's beautiful and interesting that you can take a contraption and get it to do what normally you would think of as something that requires a brain. And that you can do it in kind of this way that doesn't really use electricity. It does in the sense of turning the motor, but
Almost
not
anything
really.
from the fourth dimension to the family budget. Now, engineering students can concentrate on other important matters. For the thinking machine not only answers questions, it actually draws the solutions, charting the function of each variable.
So everybody today is so excited about sort of generative AI. Well, here we have a machine that is generating graphical output in the so-called thinking machine. So I'm just going to mention a few of my favorite science fiction. Some of you have heard me talk about these before, so jump in with questions. One that I always recommend is this Snow Crash, and it has a lot of really interesting themes. One of them is that Neil Stephenson essentially conceptualizes the metaverse, as we would call it, think of it now, or the environments that you see in Grand Theft Auto or games like that, where you have lots of people in an open environment that kind of renders like a city. And he kind of really anticipated a lot of stuff that you would get, like you would get on the bus or you would get on the train in this virtual world, and that would take you to a different part of the city, and that there would be digital real estate that would cost money and be valuable, and that people would have different avatars depending on their skill level and so on. But one of the really interesting ideas in the game is this notion of a digital artifact, in this case, a pattern that looks kind of like binary, or static, like the example here, and it crashes a human being, sort of like bad software or the blue screen of death with Windows. If you present this pattern to someone who knows how to program, it will kind of crash their nervous system. And when I first came across this idea, I thought it was kind of a cool story, but it didn't seem realistic in real life. I thought it was just something needed to make the science fiction move forward. But now that we've built neural networks, we've built machines that the idea is for them to simulate the human visual system and higher cognition after that layer, we now can attack those systems in precisely the same way. And so we have to wonder, how much do these mirror our systems? Are they true analogs for our visual system, and are we subject to the same kind of crash? And in there, as you can see on the left, it kind of goes back to ancient Sumer and the early ideas of different kinds of languages related to the Tower of Babel. And I think this is important, and more so than ever with these large language models. We're seeing that computers can be programmed in English, that English is the new computer language. And so then we have to ask the question, has English or other natural languages, like human languages like Sumerian, are these also programming languages? And if so, what does that mean, and what do these different languages support?
Language is biological prompt engineering.
100%. Yeah. Feel free to jump in. That's the big question. Do we want to think of things like language as sort of prompt training, like data set, prompt engineering? For a long time, something I've spoken with Elon about, maybe we'll get him to chime in next time, that the Bible is essentially kind of a text that you could have in your house, and it's a sufficient training set to learn from, because for a long time that would be the only book that people had, and before that it would be the only book that a village had, and they would cost as much as a farm and take it, a couple years by a craftsman to reproduce. But the importance of having one of these kind of data sets in the middle of your village, at the time they were literally chained to the church, because they were that expensive. But having one, we tend in the modern sense to think, oh well, that's just it's the religion and they keep this book and that's their prayers, and that's definitely a valid and is most certainly the case. But I think there's this other way of thinking about it, of cultures build data sets and they transfer those data sets and they train on those data sets, in that you can then build a language model in the citizens so that those citizens can participate in the government. You think of it as democracy, republic, or even just a feudal society, you still have to kind of have these LLM-like objects installed in the people so that they can participate. It reminds me of the vestigial language that we have for when most people couldn't read, they could only listen. So they understood language, but they couldn't read and write. And so when you went to court, you had to have a hearing, because to read the law was like a specialized skill. Only a few members of the society could actually really read, let alone read the law books. And so you had to have a hearing, and you had to have an audit where they would read it out loud. And there's a lot of examples like that, where you kind of see this switch of literacy taking over.
So what's the thought experiment? You're wondering if you had a Bible, would that be enough?
Yeah, is that enough? Exactly. I want to kind of try to measure that. Is that a sufficient training set?
To learn English, or to learn to learn English, or to
learn English. And then the thing that I think is really fascinating about these language models is not just that they learn English. At some point they learn, or all these kind of functions emerge, right? They can sort of do primitive logic, or they can do math, or they can sort of create verbal things like poems. And that doesn't seem like, in other words, if I went and I took a class on how to learn Spanish, I wouldn't expect, or French, or whatever it is, I wouldn't expect by the end of it that I can also do arithmetic just by
here's sort of one of the ways I was thinking about this kind of thing, right? And I guess sort of in my own way to offer up is, it would be interesting if you can engineer a universal set of instructions that will speak to you with what you need given whatever circumstance that you're in, right? Because this is what a lot of people would do when they'd go to this kind of, in the arbitrary holy book of their choosing, whatever it could be. Let's just say it's a Bible, right? Is that you go to this piece of information, and whatever situation you're in right now, whatever problem that you're trying to solve, whatever circumstance that you find yourself in, when you read this and you interface with it, you're able to get your answer from it. In many ways, it's like a
lexical record.
Yeah, I think of it as like a right. I was gonna mention it's sort of like a lower agency magic conch from SpongeBob. Like they go to the magic conch in this jungle, all right? SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward, right? Our favorite triplet. And they're out of their minds, they have no idea what's going on. And then the magic conch will just say the most there's like this optimal level of informational ambiguity where you're still able to get the answer you want from it. If it's super specific, it's harder to derive a subjective interpretation. It's like how people will say with like tarot cards or whatever, is that the ambiguity of the answer reveals more about you as the observer, right? And what you're experiencing and thinking about. Because when something is more ambiguous like that, it's almost like it's more receptive to what you're thinking, right? And it's not necessarily telling you what to think as much as you're imposing on what you're kind of thinking through that in a sense.
But that can be a feature and not a bug. And so
right, I agree.
Kind of like this snow crash pattern, I'm a big fan of random projections and sort of looking at random numbers as input to algorithms. And that's one of the things that we see with these generative systems, whether it's making art or these video systems or generating text, is you have to feed them kind of randomness. And it reminds me in the old days when they would sort of flip over their teacup and look at the tea leaves, or much other things in terms of divination, something called auspicy. We can come back to that later, but they would look at entrails and all kinds of stuff. But I think it's a very interesting input for an algorithm to have this kind of randomness. And if we think of humans, whether it's a soothsayer or a fortune teller, whatever it is, or just someone who needs to decide what to do that day, to take some random pattern and feed that into the algorithm, we now know that that's actually how artificial neural networks generate a variety of diverse outputs that are useful. And so I think it's interesting to go back and re-examine some of these things like numerancy, and divination with numbers, things like that.
I really like
try
that.
to-
I really like the fact that you have to randomize. You have to shuffle the tarot cards. You have to shake the bones before you dump them out and figure out what they mean.
It reminds me about playing poker.
Yeah.
There's something to that shuffling process of probability.
And there's something
Right.
to
So, yeah, you're testing your skill or your divination interpretation based on a random initial condition.
100%. And like a game of poker is kind of like a computer-like thing. It's not quite analog, it's not quite digital, but I've actually thought about before, how could you build a computer out of a deck of cards? I think cards are more interesting than we imagine. That they could be this older kind of thing. We see this with tarot and others, that you can do stuff there. So yeah, I love the idea of looking at randomization, and this could be why things like augury and the birds, when in the in sort of the religion of ancient Rome, where the priests would look at bird movements and things, and maybe they were getting a little bit of weather combined with a little bit of randomization combined with a little bit of time to daydream.
And what I like about this, right, is that it's fascinating what happens when you remove the modern infrastructure, something that we consider to be very intuitive, something that it feels like it's almost built into the way that we do things, but then you sit back and you really think about it and you're like, wait, this is like completely brand new in the whole scale of things. This is not even a blimp, right? As massive and insurmountable as it feels to us right now, that, wow, what could we ever do that could top this insane amount of innovation that we've put together? It's just a blimp. It's just a tiny speckle in the entire timeline of even just humans. It's not actually that long. And what's crazy is that, if you look at like what a lot of cultures that have sort of maintained in the habitats that they were trained on, we may say that, oh, they're primal or they're this or that. I don't even know if those are necessarily the best words to describe it, but I would say, in the fact that they've stayed in an ecosystem that they've been trained on, as again, this whole cultural computer coordination thing, the very parts that train them are still there in spirit, still there quite identifiably. And I think what happens with that is you then have a very finely tuned system, and this collective of people with their own different skill sets and interests or whatever, right? And it could even just be a small tribe like the Hadza tribe or whatever, right? Is that because they are still embedded in the set of parts that contextualize them and train them, so to speak, is that makes it so that they're more finely tuned, and they're able to tap into these things that we normally consider a complete mystery, right? Like the way that they're able to smell or pick up on certain kinds of animal, plant, weather patterns that are happening. The way they can kind of read what's happening in a plant or a fungi more easily than we could, unless we spend, an incredible amount of time just specifically studying that. But there's something that happens when they're embedded in that kind of culture, that there's a far transfer that happens when they train on one thing. And so the fact that they're embedded in one thing and train on one thing, and that kind of ecosystem, there's a far transfer that happens where they're able to understand other things in this so-called very natural state. And so I guess the less dramatic way, what I'm saying is that people in those ecosystems are tapped into they're able to use nature as sensors, the way that we use satellites and digital mechanical sensors and tools. They're achieving a similar purpose and utility through plants and bugs and bees and all that kind of stuff.
100%. The other science fiction story I wanted to just mention, well, one of the ones I want to mention is this idea of the idea of Babel 17, which is very similar, kind of extends the idea, not directly related, but rather than having just a signal that will mess you up, the idea here is an entire language that will mess you up. And if you learn this language, it actually installs another personality into your consciousness, kind of a multiple personality syndrome kind of thing. And that other personality ends up being a saboteur, sort of a cool intergalactic war kind of thing. The military reaches out to this poet to try to translate this text, and she realizes it's not a code, but it's an entire language. And then she learns it, and in doing so, she's able to think very, very differently. So kind of like Arrival type language, she's able to think very quickly and about very complicated situations. This story also has some other really fascinating ideas. It's not as wacky as it sounds, or maybe as wacky as it sounds. There's ghosts in this story, and the character is able to talk to these ghosts, and they're able to use this weird sort of language that's very ephemeral. The language, they sort of forget. The idea is that when ghosts talk to you, you forget what they say as fast as they say it to you, right? So it just sort of goes out of your mind. And because she knows lots of language, she very quickly translates it into Basque and then back into her language. And then by doing that, she's able to sort of capture the idea, the words of these ghosts. And what's really interesting too is that they hire these ghosts to do these tasks that would otherwise kill somebody. And so the idea is it's better off if you're dead already. And some of them have to do with navigating the spaceship, and one of them has to do with the sensors, the sort of smelling in outer space, tasks that would sort of destroy the mind of somebody who wasn't already dead, which is sort of just a fascinating idea. It's not as cheesy as it sounds, or I'm describing it, but it's actually a pretty good story. So there was a question.
I also want to add one quick thing to that, real quick, to the Babel thing. So the other way I could phrase this is, what if I told you there was a set of squiggles for you to read, and if you really, really read those squiggles for long periods of time, you can get addicted to different medications and pills. You could transform your entire set of memories, the way you talk and think about yourself, and could even put you 6 feet under the ground. That's called getting into character of a very deranged character for a movie, like a Joker kind of thing. And then there are these far transfer effects of what you embody. Is that another way to maybe think about that?
I mean, I love the idea of just like sort of, if you look at all these squiggles, you'll want to read more squiggles.
Right.
People that, like, when the popular book series come out and people are sort of waiting for the next one. I was just joking with Elon recently, and something I've thought for a while, even before the LLMs came out, that the main reason I think for aliens to visit our planet, or for us to go visit other planets that might have intelligent life, is that they will have more squiggles for us to consume. They'll have new tokens and things like that.
The squiggles are the ruling.
But there was a question. There was a question in the chat. Is it possible for an algorithm to produce true randomness? And I would say no. So John von Neumann famously said that anyone who is using a computer or an algorithm to produce random numbers is in, of course, a state of sin, he said. So he took it to sort of a religious notion in that sense, that maybe there's something sacred to randomness and all that.
Operative keyword there is pseudo-random.
Right, yeah. So we could use pseudo-random, but he said to do true random. And that's what's interesting. Where does the randomness come from? And this is something I think Wolfram did the best job I've seen so far breaking down. Was it cooked into the universe at the beginning? Is it being injected from the outside by some magic dust from a different dimension or something? Or is it generated intrinsically from some unfolding, some simple program type process? To us, it looks random, but maybe it's just the nature of sort of unfolding of the dynamics of our universe. There's another book that's on this same kind of theme of it will hurt you just to learn about the story. So I apologize if learning about these stories does you any harm. But this is a really good one in which they invent this thing it's not quite a telescope, it's not quite a microscope, they call it a macroscope, and it can kind of zoom and look at all across space and time with very high accuracy. And in doing that, there's a couple of things, but basically you see too much in that it sort of destroys people and they come away from the machine basically catatonic. But they also have this split personality kind of thing where another version will emerge, another personality who are because of that mental trauma of having too much information at once. And I would argue this is a good metaphor for the science fiction in general. I mean, this is what we're talking about, is what is real, what is not. And I think there's a lot of things, maybe they're not ready in the sense that the world doesn't have the industrial capacity to create that idea, but also probably more often than that, just the world's just not ready. I mean, think about it. The Romans could have easily made, electric wires and things like that. They could have figured it all out if they had only known how, but they weren't thinking in that direction. One of the most interesting things I come across, and it was from science fiction, I meant to put the slide in, but if anybody's ever read Isaac Asimov's Foundation, in that series, there's a character with the mule, and he has a very special musical instrument that's able to induce an emotional response in the listener. And I got really fascinated by that from first principles of why that didn't exist. And in searching for that and tracing that down, I found two really fascinating things. One was this story about a musical language by machine intelligence, and the other was the ocular harpsichord, which was a kind of a piano that plays colors. And these ideas to me are too interesting to be science fiction only, and worse than that, they're incredibly obscure. Like, you can't even find this book in English on the internet, and that just doesn't make sense compared to how much stuff's on the internet. And it's hard to find anything that's like the ocular harpsichord. So, this kind of retro future where we have machines like this picture is decades old, but we didn't have the generative AI to build that, and then how do we kind of bridge this gap between music and thinking about the machines in kind of an analog sense. So I just had a few more slides I wanted to flip through to talk about these kind of the future we never saw, this kind of retro future computers that were too expensive for them to be in any high number. And again, they're too old to be taught in any technology curriculum, and they're too new to be any history curriculum. And so they just kind of disappeared from the radar. I would love to try to recreate a lot of these in a virtual reality headset or something like that, just so that we can experience what it was like to kind of walk inside a computer, because I still see these things and they kind of look like a weird fiction, maybe some episode of Stargate or Star Trek where they went through some other reality and they found these people that invented computers, but in the 19th century or whatever. But it turns out we did invent computers much sooner than anyone would imagine. This one actually has a little rocket. This thing right in the front is sort of a physical diagram of the state of the rocket as you would fly it through the trajectory simulation. And so you could watch it kind of go and fly around. Again, we never got to see these up close because they were expensive and classified or whatever. And so I think it's neat to go back and look at this kind of science that feels like fiction but wasn't. This one could do 50,000 flights of the Saturn rocket per second. So this is a good plug for analog computing, something I don't think is taught anywhere, but we should be covering that more. And then I want to just recommend that everybody takes a look at this movie, World on a Wire. It's really fantastic. It's kind of a mini series. Came out in 1978. It's German with English subtitles. I don't want to say too much about it, but highly recommended it. And then one final book that was really influential on me as a kid, curious if anybody's ever read it, Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of, I used to call it Nymph, but then I later, as an adult, realized it was the National Institute of Mental Health. And I had no idea that connotation. So there's kind of all these layers that we read things once as a kid, and we're like, oh yeah, here's this cool story about talking rats. And then later you grow up and you work and read grants and things from these kinds of institutes. And so you get the opportunity to go back and can re-examine these ideas. And so that's just what I wanted to share. This, when we look at the world, a lot of times we put ideas into what we call a story, and that makes it so that we can swallow the idea. I think it's a very powerful thing. You can get people to consider some of your ideas if sometimes they're unthinkable. And so if you're working on something complicated or really interesting, I recommend writing a short story. Use the AI to help if you want to get some ideas, but take it and put it into a clever narrative, and then you'd be surprised how many more people will entertain your idea than they might not otherwise. So in the sense, a shameless plug for a short story I wrote a few years ago, actually before GPT came out, at least the public versions, and you can find that at lethaltext.ai. So I really appreciate everybody. Thanks, Addy, for putting this together. Thanks, everybody, for the awesome questions. Always good to hang out in the salons.
I want to say, like, I like the idea of you have these ethos, you have a set of information, and you bring it into the mind, and it's like a software that you run in the mind, and you'll get like some sort of output, desired outcome or undesired outcome, or whatever it is. I mean, in the case of like religions, Yosha Bach would say that religion is like a software for the mind, and the outcome is like you have I guess there are a couple of outcomes. You have like alignment between like a social group or a society, and you have some sort of interpersonal advantages of how you approach life and how you manage your own soul, I guess.
100%. And it does stuff. It's something I've been thinking about a lot more lately, in that it's a kind of virtual machinery, and that we tend, in the old world, people were like, oh yeah, religion's super real and does stuff. And then kind of the modern world, we're like, oh, it's just kind of the scientific worldview on top of it. And I think now that we know about prompts and I think what we're going to see next generation, because the prompt is just kind of like a knee jerk. You put the prompt in, you get some sort of output. But the thing I've been thinking about is when we bite the tail on these networks, and then we kind of like seed and kick off thunderstorms, right? And real little mini brainstorms in these language models, or whatever we'll call them at that point. And I think that's kind of what we see with religion, that when we install these things into people, not to be pejorative with the word installation, but when people become adherents of a faith, let's say, then they're operating in this, this kind of distributed pseudo analog fuzzy logic distributed CPU or something. It's a network. It's doing stuff. It has rules. It has grammars, and there's this, in the Ruliad kind of world, it's searching for different ways to operate society, and but it has its own like mechanisms. It has legal things and governance and feedback loops, and it has all this kind of multi-hierarchy, because you've got like family units, and then you've got little governments, and then you've got soccer teams, and everything in between that are operating on that grid, that dynamic mesh of nodes. But it runs. If you were to zoom out, you'd be like, oh yeah, there's all kinds of happenings there.
Well, that was an
same can be true for people get radicalized politically, or political movements happen. It's like you have this platform, this ethos, and then people rally behind it. I mean, another thing is like nationalism is another form of ethos. A couple thousand years ago, we weren't doing that, and then some city-states got to be like, okay, well, we have these regions, they have borders, they have flags, and everyone gets behind it. We're part of Rome, and that means something. Yeah. To add to the point.
Absolutely, and those are contagious in a sense, and I think kind of like hurricanes, they can spin themselves off, or they can become tornadoes or whatever, and then the famous Texas butterfly, Amazon thunderstorm kind of thing, and we see that ripple effect now with these networks, where one person or a small group of people can just post a few things, and then suddenly 6 months later there's global conflict, and it's hard to pin them down and be like, oh, it's because that person, oh, you liked that click. I mean, imagine how mind-boggling it would be if you could somehow trace those influence networks. And I imagine the top social media companies, that's what they're trying to do.
This also reminds you of the hypnosis thing that Albert talks about, right? Our friend Albert, the hypnotist from Toronto. Something interesting, right, is I think there's certain kinds of information that the nature of reading it and experiencing it and interfacing with it puts you into a more hypnotic state?
Yeah, so I think this idea of software that's made out of people, it's made out of words, and we've known this. Bureaucracies are thousands of years old, like you said, the city-states themselves, and then they make up these kind of arbitrary codes, and they're like, oh, you're one of these. You didn't know you're one of these things, and it's like, well, that's not real. Or at least it's not something that's even been around for more than a few hundred years. And so those kind of labels, I think, are what causes a lot of conflict, because we're trying to map it, directly to something that's not how people work.
I was going to mention, now that
Have you
I'm
read?
back.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go for it. Go for it.
No, I was just gonna bring up Yuval Noah Harari's framework around stories as being like kind of these conceptual kind of glue or an operating system that brings together a lot of these notions and propels them through time, which I think, I'm very interested to parse like how that is maybe distinct from this idea of the language being auto-regressive. Is language different than stories, or are we talking about the same thing?
And yeah, interesting. Great question. I really like the quote that the world's not made out of atoms, it's made out of stories. And the idea that the stories are themselves alive, I think, is something that we need to consider. And it's one of those things that classically it's not even so much that it didn't make sense. You could have thought it, but people would have said, okay, that's a metaphor. Okay, the story is alive because people are changing it. But now that we can see with like the internet and things like how they go viral, that they are kind of alive, at least as much as little germs and things are. And we haven't really thought about what that means. And one thing I think is really interesting with AI is we're going to resurrect a bunch of old, I would say dead or extinct or nearly extinct stories are going to come back to life, whether that's sort of translating clay tablets or just stories that fell out of popular, circulation, and they're going to kind of get revived. And like we were just saying a minute ago, they do stuff in the world, right? Stories have impacts, and books and things literally change the world. So I think it's a great question. In terms of the auto-regressive thing, one idea I had a long time ago when I was first thinking about learning machines and AI was, how do you write a book such that you write the first half of the book and then the book takes over and writes the second half? Like, what would that first half of that book have to have in it such that the book then could then write itself? And we now, in some way, one way to do it would be to just squeeze an LLM and a Python interpreter and all, a Docker and all that. And you would put that painstakingly in the first half of the book, and then you could say, now go, and it would write. So we're almost there. Like, we can almost do that, and think about like, what's that first part? And then the other idea that I'm really fascinated by is, what's the minimal set? Like we were talking about earlier, like, what's the smallest amount of books? And then could you kind of do it from first principles, right? So it's hard to imagine how you would train a language model without giving it examples of language. But if we take the Earth as a whole and we zoom out, and we watch from the moon over the last, 100,000 years, 1 million years, something like that, that whole system did just emerge language from right, de novo, like this kind of sui generis thing. So how do we bootstrap? If we had all the compute cycles in the world, if you had a gajillion GPUs and that didn't matter, what do? Do you simulate Eden and floods and arcs, and do you go through the timeline and little battles and simulate whatever, and then eventually they create books to do trade and commerce like we saw in Mesopotamia? Or is there some more mathematical, elegant way where you can just say, no, take these equations, maybe something Ostrov would think of, where you say, no, from these first principles, you take space-time and you fold it in itself and you bite it and it'll go and eventually language will come out of that. Now, again, at a large enough scale, that is what happened, right? That's what happened in this chunk of the universe. We had nothing but physics, and we ran physics engine forward long enough, and now we have language models, and now we're putting those language models into computers. So what's the smallest amount? What's the cheapest, fastest way that us to do that? Is it to download the library? That's how we're doing it now. Is it to simulate a village and ancient city-states? Probably not, but it would be kind of cool to see it. That's like World on a Wire. Check out that movie. And then is the other, in a cool way, do we have to simulate all of this, vast region of space-time and simulate it for countless number of years, and then eventually that thing will also have language.
What's interesting is as a potentially a complementary example about the initial conditions of a story kind of thing is I think a lot about skateboarding. Right now, what happens when you skateboard? Right, you have this wooden piece or whatever, and just by putting your feet in this very simple kind of position, you kick up on it in a pretty simple way, all things considered. And now you get this very chaotic system that does it what you want it to without you even having to touch it. And then you can also interact and catch it in exactly the way you want it to. And I think skateboarding is a very interesting study from a physics perspective or complex systems or whatever, about studying chaos and noise and randomness and probability. And it's that, what are these initial conditions that you can set down on in the board while it's on the ground, such that it'll take advantage of the chaos of less constraints, sort of like what fiction does. And you can still get what you want out of it when you land back onto it. Do you kind of see the analogy I'm getting at with that?
Yeah, I think like the ability to simulate little physics worlds that's the next step we're going to see in AI, of giving them tiny, like 10 million little skateboards and say, here, figure it out. How does that sort of thing work? Because there's a lot of stuff from first principles about classical physics and tabletop physics and everything else that we don't know yet. I gotta jump myself, but this was super fun.
Cool. Any last couple of things you wanna wrap up with?
Let me see if I had any other notes here. Yeah, I had this sort of joke that science fiction isn't real. And the joke there is that it's not about the future. It's never about the future. It's about now, and even more than that, it's often about the near past or the far past. The nature of things is you can't go in all the directions at once, except for in reality. So in a story, you pick one thing, or a small number of things. You say we're going to have faster than light travel, or we're going to have teleporters, or we're going to have laser beams, or whatever. But you can't go in all the directions. And the interesting thing about reality is going in all the directions. There are people who are working on fusion and laser guns and faster than light and everything you can imagine, biotech and AI and chips and every possible thing. And that's what's fascinating and makes science fiction interesting, but kind of impossible, is that we can't do it. So instead we pick one narrow direction and we use it to analyze, social behaviors and things like that. So I think it's powerful in that sense. But we need to think about taking things like future studies seriously. You can imagine there was a time when there was no such thing as history, and now there's hardly something called future studies, but I think that's a thing to take serious. And to look at science fiction, we should be mining science fiction stories. We should be using LLMs to go back to all the short stories from the last 100 years or more and say, are there any good ideas here yet? What are some things that you could do with an hour with an LLM coding agent and internet and whatever? So that's kind of the thing that you have to suspend disbelief. That the most important part of science fiction is to just pause. And that's what I was saying earlier, that if you have an idea, a genuine idea that you're working on, wrap it inside a sci-fi narrative, even if it's a bad one, just to get it out there. It's kind of sugarcoating the medicine. And then remember, the modern world, that everything that we're doing, from this video call to the internet to the modern conveniences like a supermarket, mundane things like that, are absolutely science fiction from the previous generations. These are thought forms, as Michael Levin likes to reference. And I think that everything started as just an idea in the real, and everything that's in the real world, whether it's an automobile to an airplane, at one point was just a crazy conception. And we realized all of those things. And so imagine how many things are sitting there in the science fiction books that in 25 years or so we'll look back and say, wow, we could have invented that sooner, just like most of the things in science fiction. So with that, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Where can people find you online?
Check out my YouTube channel, William Edward Hahn.
we'll link that in the description for everyone as well. Anything else? Any maybe Twitter/X, future Substack, anything like that?
Yeah, I'll
Maybe
put
your,
it up.
your book already, your podcast.
Yeah, you can check out the first edition of my book, Lethal Text. I'll put the link. It's on Amazon. You can check that out. It has a lot of these kind of cool themes in it.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll let you go, and we'll continue the conversation for a little bit afterwards.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Great
All
to
right,
see you.
Take care.
Take care.
All right. Cool.
Thanks, Will.
All right. And then there were what, 6 of us. Okay. DVZ, you just joined on right as Will took off. We were talking about similar stuff we were discussing earlier. But I guess one of the things I want to talk about now is these definitions of fiction and the process of creating it, because when we were talking earlier about, or I guess when Will just last said that, about suspending your disbelief in things, is that's also what you do when you imagine and you simulate things inside of your head, right? In order to think of an idea, the nature of simulating that thing is you're technically operating off of less constraints than there actually kind of would be in the real life physical scenario of things, right? And there's a very interesting thing where it's like, you sort of see this with, when people say live out your dreams or follow your ambitions or whatever, is that there's something that happens in this very cognitive process of the idea, the concept, the gestalt almost, right? This sort of ambiguous, abstract thing. And it's not technically physically, I'd say it's real. It may not be physical. But one of the things that happens is you have to almost buy into that in order to actualize the thing, right? And so you're almost buying into this controlled delusion, this imaginative thing, right, in order to instantiate it. And so again, when you think of an idea, you're actually kind of creating a fiction in your mind. When you're constructing it could literally be anything. It's technically kind of fiction because you're not operating off of the same so-called real world constraints that are out there in front of you. And I think just like what I was saying earlier,
it's a fiction, but it's based off of some existing elements. It's like you can't ever really think about something completely new off the wall, like left field typically, right? It's like you have these elements, you're making new combinations between them. And in the case of sci-fi, it's like it's sci-fi genre because it's like, okay, take existing technological elements and then see what they could do in a possible like scenario. And then that's going to lead right into what engineers do. To engineer something, you have to first like conceive of what you're trying to do, have a direction to like work towards. And so that's why like sci-fi is like one step ahead of actual technological development, because the sci-fi authors are doing the hard work of using their imagination to probe what could be possible, what would be nice to have.
Yeah, and I think I really like the sci-fi author Ted Chiang. He wrote the story behind the movie Arrival, if any of y'all have seen that. But one of the things he talks about is he doesn't think sci-fi novels or like anything longer than a short story is any good for science fiction, because he says science fiction is best when it imagines a future technology and explores the consequences of that technology existing in the world. And you don't need to stretch that out any longer than a short story. It doesn't make sense to. It's sort of his assertion.
Yeah, I agree that like a short story is a good format for just bringing an idea to light. I don't know. I'm trying to think of like what are the advantages to longer form stories. I guess if you have a bunch of dynamical relationships between characters that you want to like that require more episodes. Let's say like Game of Thrones is all about this. Sort of seeing what would happen in a emergent system of complex social interactions.
I think for a longer story to be any good, you have to have lots and lots of new technology, so it can't just be one thing. And then you explore sort of the consequences. So like a lot of the longer sci-fi that's good is like Star Wars or Star Trek or things like that. And in those, they don't just have one new technology. The entire world's completely different, and there's all of this cool stuff everywhere. And whereas I can't think of a lot of sci-fi that's good for a long time that's just sort of based on one new technology.
I'm gonna push back on that a little bit if I could. Is Star Wars really sci-fi. They have guns and swords, and it's just a space drama. You know, they have colonial imperialization in the form of Star Destroyers and things like that, but it's not. It's just
They had a lot of technology, and technology kind of activated a lot of the story elements too. But maybe not. Maybe the technology wasn't so critical to activating those story elements.
Well, Star Wars was this very interesting juxtaposition between wizardry and technology. Right, technological wizards. Right, you have, there's this force, you can touch this thing, and there's this field that's sort of ambiguous and ethereal or whatever. But then there's also lightsabers and starships and galaxies and all these kinds of things, and it's this very interesting mixing and matching of all these different kinds of parts. And it's interesting that you can. I wanted to sort of think about, again, sort of like what we were talking earlier about. Okay, you're combining these different things to get this output. Right, even the nature of computing something, even just literally just calculating something, adding something, and adding machine, is you're connecting two parts to create the sum. And so sort of this idea that people will talk about, where it's like, oh, is the whole greater than the sum of the parts? I actually think that may be a slightly flawed statement in a weird way, because the nature of combining anything is then saying how they're also the same. You could say you have one apple and one orange. And it's only until you combine them can you say you have two fruits. You're adding a quantity to a category to something that they share an invariance. You're quantizing, you're quantifying the invariance or whatever, right? And they're technically not added together. If you say you have one apple and one orange, it's only until you put them under a covering, shared distribution, that you can even attribute that number to that. But that's also still this idea of coordination. And what happens is how are we able to stitch together, let's say, non-fictional things, so-called real things, and connect them where they can create something that's fictional? And then likewise, how can you connect and coordinate parts and elements? Right? Think of a graph, a node graph, whatever. How can you connect and coordinate these parts that are then fictional that can then create non-fiction? And there's this sort of back and forth between those kinds of elements. I'm curious if any of you guys have thought about that before in some capacity. What I'm kind of getting at is I think there's the nature of cognition itself is what lets you tap into fiction. I'm saying fiction is actually a very important aspect of everything that we consider cognitive or informational. And it's the idea that you can have these different forms of continuity, right? Like we were talking about.
I mean, it's future planning is sort of like one of the main things of
exactly. The nature of prediction itself.
Imagine.
If only Alon was here to talk about auto generation.
Well, I mean, a rat navigating a maze, like it'll go to like a fork. There are a couple options, and it has to think about, do I remember this direction where that goes in the underground set of tunnels that I'm working in, or it's just you have to imagine each scenario and then pick the best one that is available to you, or that you think is the best one based on the scenario that you're playing out in your head.
I had a friend who's a pan-computationalist, so he's like, well, there is no such thing as cognition and brains being unique things. Everything's doing computation, and they're all doing that to make sure they survive, et cetera, et cetera. So rocks are doing computation of some sort. But
don't trust him. He's a philosophical zombie.
Yeah, thank you. But I had a long conversation with him. We were talking about consciousness, and something we realized is that people's intuitions for what is conscious and how much a thing is conscious maps really closely onto the complexity of the counterfactuals that an organism can generate. And so I think there's something to what you're saying, where a rock can't really generate any counterfactual. So even if it's doing some kind of computation to preserve its existence, maybe it's not like a rock's not like, oh, I could fall down this hill or fall down this hill, so I'm going to choose this one. Insect can produce counterfactuals just a tiny amount, where it can be like, oh, if I go in the direction of this smell, I can eat. And if I don't do that, I won't eat. And then you get up to humans, and we have fiction, which seems like a very uniquely human thing, and fiction is just sort of extremely, extremely complex counterfactuals. So we can ask questions like, what would happen if someone else won World War One, or something like all of these questions that are, or what happens if people had magic powers and it was the future and also there were lasers and all of this other great stuff. So I think there's something to this idea that complex counterfactuals are a sign of consciousness.
Well, it's the nature of paradox.
I mean, robots,
Yeah, go ahead.
AIs have tons of, they can entertain an infinite number of potential counterfactuals, right?
I don't know that they can actually. I think they can. You have to kind of prompt them to create counterfactuals, and then they do a good job of playing it out. But
Right.
another thing is the counterfactuals they create are very close to what already exists out there, and so they're not doing a lot of like what I would call creative work. So I play around with the AI to do like AI storytelling sometimes just in my free time, and I'm like, oh, and then this happens, and then what would happen if this happens, et cetera, et cetera. And everything they create sounds like the first thing you would find in a $2 book in an airport or something like that. None of it's like super creative or surprising.
I was also going to say that I think like there's something about the nature of paradox, right? Of discontinuity, about the ability that you can connect things that are discontinuous, things that are paradoxical, and you can get something else emerges from connecting paradoxes and resolving this thing that we call a paradox. And again, the fact, it's sort of like the liar's paradox. It's this super meta thing where it's like the fact that we can even think and talk about a paradox, right? And I think paradoxes are this not a negative artifact, but a very positive artifact in reflection of the nature of being an observer, right? And I was going to say that I think, the things that we call randomness and probability, those are extremely important built-in necessities about being an observer. And I think the act of being an observer, that's tapping into this latent space, platonic space, whatever the heck it is, right, is you get this thing that we call a paradox. We get this thing called discontinuity. We get this thing called fiction. And then when you look at this as, oh, these are all just kind of, again, information is observer dependent, whatever. And then you look at cognition and perception and observation across scales and shapes and sizes, right? What does fiction look like? Again, if we're going to channel into Michael Levin here, how do cells perceive fiction? If we were to ride that analogy all the way down to the level of cells and proteins, right? What are paradoxes and fictions for them? How do they process things that are fictional or paradoxical? I think this ties into perceptions of different nodes in a cellular network or whatever that you get things.
So the flagella on one of these like little amoebas zipping around, if you spin it one way, it's like this twisting thing, right? And it has this like wire, hair or something that spirals out. So you turn it one way, it'll coil and propel you forward, and if you spin it the other way, it'll just kind of like unwind. You kind of go backwards. So they definitely like move forward until something happens that's unexpected. They get to a barrier, or they get to like a chemical gradient that they don't like, and then they kind of back off. So I would imagine, different chemical environments would be their fiction. They're trying to get to like this nice sucrose-laden land of opportunity.
They have a platonic idea of the chemical environment.
Perception and observation itself is fictional because you're never seeing the whole thing, right? Like I was just talking with someone earlier yesterday, or I think it was yesterday or day before, about the nature of like invisible beings and invisible systems. Like, we have some pretty good eyes right now. They work quite well for what we want to use them for, but there's plenty of things that we can't see with our eyes or our brain. They're there. There could be other kinds of dynamical systems that if given the right mind, you could tap into that and be like, oh, this actually could be a kind of living system. I think Michael Levin has talked about this to some degree, but I actually think that again, the nature of being an observer, being an observer means that you are experiencing something that's kind of fictional. It's not the whole picture, right? It's the blind man and the elephant story again. It's that in order to build this cognitive system that's able to problem solve and abstract and theorize and scale and iterate and whatever, is you actually want limitation and constraint. And I think the literal shape, if we were to geometrically understand properties of an observer, right? I don't even literally mean like, okay, the physical shape of an eye. I don't even just mean that, but I mean the relational structure of geometrical structures, right?
So you have a
you
finite
get some,
set of apparatuses that are sensory apparatuses that are feeding in, whatever signals that you're sending. And
right.
you're sort of collecting this
Right.
data
Right.
as an observer, and then
right.
that's your scope. That's all you get.
Yeah.
Now,
What do
those sensors are like pulling out data from the environment, from the world, and each sensor has limitations.
But there's two ways that you can be an observer and observe things, and I guess observe things in a way that another observer cannot. One is sensory apparatus, right? So dogs can see the world in a way we cannot because they have very sensitive noses. Another, though, is cognition, in that you can put together, you can do a sort of pattern recognition and recognize that there is a thing there that's sort of causing another thing. So like, I think if a dog walks into an elevator, or maybe even something less smart than a dog, it would think that somehow the elevator was a teleporter. And the doors close and then the doors open and the room's completely different, and it would be like magic. But because we're humans and we have more complex cognition, we can put things together and we can say, oh, I'm feeling movement. Oh, I see wires. Oh, someone told me about how this works before. And so I understand that this thing is moving up and down. So in that way, even if you have the same senses, you would still be missing something that was there just because of how complex it is.
Right.
It's like the Rubin telescope. I mean, to me, that feels like it feels so fictional somehow. But
yeah, what do
know,
you mean by that? I see your comment there. So
yeah, I don't
I guess
know.
I'm
Like
not familiar with what the Rubin telescope is putting out.
we're sort of imposing visual interpretation onto data that isn't actually visual in the way that we're articulating it in those
right. So it's all these different
images.
bands from the electromagnetic spectrum, and then you're mapping that to RGB to the one octave that we can see.
Right, exactly. And kind of in some sense, is that somehow analogous to creating a fiction or a story about these phenomena that are being collected, this data that's being collected through these incredibly sensitive sensors?
Yeah. I mean, there is this thing where it's that, like what Dr. Hahn was saying a bit earlier about the way we create narratives, right? And stories, and that, these things are visual stories and visual narratives. This is visual-spatial continuity, but it's inherently limited because of the fact that you're interpreting something. It's like, could you say, is there such a thing as a literal interpretation? Right? Is there such a thing as a truly literal interpretation, or is everything just a subjective, observer-dependent slice of this greater thing, or whatever it is that you're trying to tap into? And again, this is also the interesting thing about the social computer, cultural computing thing, or another way I've been thinking of calling it is coordination computing, something like that. I don't know, messing around with the names for now, but one of the things that happens in this culture, and is, I'll say, I mean it in a very literal sense, actually, that culture is the circuit board of humanity. It's the circuit board of social systems, right? It's the thing that aligns and synchronizes and does all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that's interesting about why I find neurodiversity, not just neurodiversity in humans, but diversity of mind and other kinds of cognitive systems as well, is that they're different shapes of minds. They're different shapes. The observers have different shapes that let them tap into different things. It's sort of like you can tap into a different way of measuring just depending on how many lines you add in between each line. It sounds so simple and dumb. Okay, you add more lines, but that's letting you do something else just by putting these kinds of arbitrary lines that represent a quantity or whatever, right? And I think minds are doing a very similar thing. And so when an LLM is responding to something and you're responding to a similar kind of stimulus, there are different ways of tapping into potentially something that's invariant between them. And I've talked about this before where it's like, actually, well, all right, I'm going to pivot slightly to something else, maybe more interesting. Agricultural circuits, fungi circuits, plant circuits, is if you actually take the whole of the kind of earth ecosystem of rocks, fungi, small plants, trees, the clouds, lightning, all these kinds of things, what do they look like if you take that macrocosm and you make it a microcosm, right? Like a true microcosm. Like you take the whole thing and you scale it down and you concentrate it and you cluster it, right? The elements that make up the things that we call our minds or our brains exist scattered at different scales all throughout the planet. But it's only until a coordinating force is brought together that you can cluster them and connect them and integrate them where they represent Nicholas or Dugan or DVZ or Michael or L or whoever, right? And something that's interesting is that you could basically take over the frameworks that we used to understand circuitry in traditional forms of computing and somewhat decently apply that over to the coordination system of fungi and the soil and the minerals and the worms and the bugs and the different plants and the trees and all these kinds of things. Like, what does an agricultural circuit board look like? Like, how do you connect fungi in a smaller scale, in a more concentrated, integrated scale, right? Which could literally be the size of just even a small table or something. It's just how we scale down circuit boards in computers. What happens if you scale down those big ecosystems in nature? What's something that you get? I think those things will look like more traditionally living systems, because there's something that happens when you compress scale down in time and in space, that it starts to look like traditionally thought of living systems, right? And this again goes to the thought experiment I've talked about before, where you can have, a very long time lapse of waves crashing and weather changing on the Earth or whatever, or even another planet, right? Whatever it is, whatever phenomenon is happening. And if you speed that up just a ton, like that's going to look like a living, breathing, dynamical, adapting system if you just really, really speed it up, right? But also, if you take things that we consider to be very biological, living, real things like ourselves, and if you were to scale that down, slow that down in the same scale, then you'd be like, oh, it looks like tumbleweed. It doesn't look like it's doing anything. It looks like waves and rocks and stones. It doesn't look like it's doing anything. And so there's, once again, this nature of observer dependency, of fiction and continuity and all these things about the way we're perceiving what a living system or a learning system or a fictional system are. Are you sort of getting at the vibe I'm pointing towards here at all, maybe?
That's interesting. I mean, to think about person and to try to get a minimal model for what a person is, like as far as humans are concerned or people in the society, it's like they think of a person as, okay, a person's there and then they have sort of a set of thoughts and a set of like ethos and a set of experiences, and they have a certain like linguistic output relative to other persons and a certain amount of like behaviors relative to other people, and they do certain things as output. And it's like none of that incorporates like, oh, there are a bunch of like these atoms, or they have all these organs, or like their physical characteristics are almost secondary to like what their personality is.
I also think, also DVZ, we were discussing this before about style and all that kind of stuff, is there's something that happens when you bring together a bunch of, and actually L, as an artist, you could also, and I guess Dugan too is also, you could qualify as an artist, but in my mind, all scientists and thinkers are artists in their own weird ways. But on the nature of style and the perception of style, is what happens when you are able to coordinate a bunch of different styles together. What is the emergent property of coordinating different styles? Because you don't want to just average them out. there's some other way of combining and integrating those different parts, those styles, that you can get something emergent. Because I don't think it's fair to say you're getting something very synergistic if you just average things out. I think that's useful for certain things, but that's just that's one way of coordinating information, is by averaging something out. But there's also other ways, and I think this actually gets down to the foundations of quantity and mathematics itself. These things that we consider so kind of intuitive or natural, where it's like, oh, you're adding things, subtracting, dividing, multiplying. Here's a strange thing. You can add value by removing something. All right, here's a thought experiment on this thing about coordination. We think of coordination as adding things, right? You're adding parts together. You're adding money to your bank account. You're adding calories to your plate, whatever. But in this weird sort of informational sense, you can actually add value by removing things. You can add negative space. You can coordinate negative space. All right, this also ties into other things I'll get into in a second. But the first thought experiment would be, if you think of a big chunk of stone, right? That big chunk of stone, that each of the particles and chunks of that rock have value. That's raw material that can be used for all these different things. But interestingly, if you use that raw material as an analogy for the Platonic space and the latent space thing, it's only until you chip away at it and you constrain it and you limit it, do you then get this very fancy sculpture that could sell for $1 million kind of thing, right? And again, you can physically taking away information, you're adding more information and perceived value to something, right? We literally pay people absurd amounts of money to make systems more efficient. And what happens a lot of those times is you're literally removing stuff, right? We pay people to remove stuff out of our buildings and our streets and all these kinds of things. And there's something to the nature, again, of mathematics itself, is that you can add something that's negative, something you can coordinate parts that are opposites of each other, right? So maybe another way of thinking about this is, this negative space thing in terms of music, right? Where the sound plays is equally as important as where the sound doesn't play, right? And you have to have that kind of
you're adding anticipation.
Right. But again, that's creating that property of anticipation by creating these weird kinds of cadence and flows of all those things. What's the Stevie Z you're saying about software engineers?
It's very related to this idea of taking something away to add value. A saying I've heard many times is the average software engineer writes code, a good software engineer deletes code, and a great software engineer avoids code.
Nice.
So the idea is a great software engineer figures out a way to write the program that's simpler that still accomplishes the same goal, because that's more valuable and have less bugs and all that good stuff.
Yeah. And I guess also philosophically, this ties into the thing about like these very, very fundamental structures of perception, where it's like, you know something by what it's not, by the negation. Like you can tell black from white and white from black because they're these polar opposites of each other. You can tell them by what they're not. But interestingly, right, the only way that you can even tell those things apart is because they share something similar. You can describe and even think and talk about black or white because you're talking about the shared property that you're experiencing, luminance or whatever you want to call it, right? And it's the same thing. I mean, it's the way we frame images. It's the reason that we can see the squiggles on the piece of paper or the screen. It's because there's contrast. What that is fundamentally is this thing that we call contrast. And if there's no contrast, if there's no boundary, there is no line in the sand, you can't actually see anything. That is that then unbound latent space that's sort of ambiguous and you have to find a way to tap into that by differentiating, by constraining and limiting that. And that's how you get that. I think that again ties into the negative space kind of thing. But then even just like the nature of how we perceive motion, right? Is that what's the thing that exists between the frames of motion, right? The frame rate of vision. I mean, I think you can learn a lot about this by how we create things that look like they're moving through stop motion animation.
Vector information. I mean, you're watching things move. You can track that, and that's what you're interpreting. If you're doing interpolation at all, that's how upscaling frame rate works on some systems. And then another thing is, like, all this new video AI generation models. a sort of how well are they doing physics, or how well are they doing the job of an animator. Like Japanese animation was really, when it came on the scene, it was very good because it was very detailed. They had a higher level of detail, a high level of physical realism. And I don't think that the animators are actually like behind the scenes, like computing all this the physical information. They're just really honing in on what it looks like for these things to go flying around. You know, like Akira was like, you know, he had all these bikes zipping around, and the mechanics of that was like on point.
If you guys have seen anything about like between frames in animation where it looks super janky, it actually turns out that to animate something that looks accurate to the human eye, you have to do things that are sort of physically impossible.
Fiction strikes again. And so I guess again the theme of this, right? And I guess the theme of the salon is, I will have to wrap up in a little bit, but the nature of how you coordinate parts to create fiction is I mean, and I guess going back to the frame rate, stitching the stills together to create something that has the perception of being you know, moving or dynamical or whatever, is it gets very. Have any of you tried those frame rate glasses before? There are these glasses you can get that basically add a frame rate to your vision. They're glasses, right? It's pretty non-invasive, and you know, you can play around with.
Down?
Yeah, I think they're called like
Okay.
Synaptech or something, and they just slow down your frame rate significantly. They just add blank, 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 and you can play around with the shape and all these kinds of things. And well, actually, what it does if you train with that is it increases your frame rate, because it's getting your brain used to the less information, so it forces this kind of hormesis response, as I always talk about, right? Like an overcompensation. But again, I also think the hormesis and overcompensation thing is the nature of this predicting, this generation thing that you do when you coordinate different pieces of information. Is if you look at the end result, the idea, as the thing that's doing the instantiating, the thoughts that are doing the thinking, then that sort of does explain the nature of emergence by combining certain things and integrating them together, right? Like, for instance, you can't just take you know, two V6 engines, put them next to each other, or even just connect them in some areas and just say, oh, this is now a V12, right? You have to sort of redo a bit of both of them and find a way to integrate them by rearranging both of them to form one coherent system that you can then call a V12 engine kind of thing.
Yeah, you need,
and again,
some
even
sort of, torque combiner.
Yeah. But this is also the nature, I think, of how we combine ideas and combine thoughts. I think this is how different areas of the brain and body literally communicate with each other. I think communication and language is integration and and coordination. I actually, I would say these are all sort of more or less a very, very similar thing. And I think one of the reasons why there are certain kinds of dissociative cognitive states is because the internal language that your mind is using to interpret itself is changing. And I actually don't even know if that's necessarily a negative thing. I think you just have to know how to utilize and leverage that. And I'd say here's a strange way of thinking about it, is each part of the brain is badly designed for what it's not built for. Like, you don't want a hippocampus to do what another area of the brain is doing, kind of thing, per se. All right, so if you think of it in that kind of funny way, it's like each part of the brain is badly designed for something else, but it's only until they're all connected and coordinated and integrated together do they have this thing that we call, you know, this thing that we're doing right now: experience, cognition, perception. Curious if you thought about that, Dugan or DVZ, because I know we've spoken a little bit about this before. The sort of the internal, I'd say that the physics, the language of physics, the way that you can instruct and integrate and coordinate these materials across different scales to create something like a brain, and looking at it as a kind of language.
I've never thought about it as language, but the brain is really fascinating as opposed to artificially created cognitive systems because it is extraordinarily multi-scale. It seems like and multi-scale both in time and space. So there's calcium waves, which are these quite slower processes, and they don't happen through electricity at all. And in some sense, it seems like that's because electricity would be too quick for what you use calcium waves for, which is you use calcium waves to switch between different types of thinking and trigger cortical phase transitions. And you don't want to do that too quickly. You want that to be a slow process because you want to be able to be like, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, let me go do this for 2 seconds and then go back to doing the main thing I was doing. And you don't want your whole brain to transition while you're doing that one other thing for 2 seconds.
I like, yeah.
Yeah, and then obviously we can talk about, it seems very clear. It doesn't seem clear to me that that's where consciousness comes from, or that's where all the important stuff is going on sort of at the quantum level of the brain, like Hammock would say. But it does seem very clear that the brain is doing
The
computation.
microtubules.
Yes, it does seem very clear that the brain is doing computation that has impacts all the way down at the quantum level. And sort of the different levels of the brain are all sort of doing different things. And those are all sort of very interesting. And so, yeah, I haven't thought about it as a language before.
Yeah, it's just sort of like these arbitrary squiggles or symbols or whatever are tapping into a different latent space. And it's only until you stitch them together are they able to form this greater, generally useful, coherent thing that we call a word, right? Or an entire language, right? And again, can you actually say there's an end to the language? Because you can just generate more of the language.
Not every language, just our language.
Which other languages would you say you can't generate more of?
There's been some rare languages that have been found in a couple of tribes where you can't make up new words.
Is it that they're just not using them as new words, or there's some like very informational reason that you can't actually do that?
Like, from my understanding, the grammar doesn't allow you to. And so there's one particularly famous language that was studied by this guy who was a missionary, and he ended up losing faith in God and becoming a linguist, but he still went and hung out with the tribe and studied their language.
Fascinating.
And their language didn't have it made the Chomskyans really angry because it didn't have abstraction or the ability to refer to things that weren't like that were fictional, that a lot of these features that normal languages have. So an example is before he became a linguist, when he was a missionary, he would talk about Jesus, and the tribes people he would say, Jesus said this, and the tribes people would be like, oh, so you know this guy? He'd be like, no, I don't know the guy. He lived thousands of years ago. And they would be like, well, how do you know he said this? Because they didn't have a way in their language to express the fact that he had been told a story that Jesus said this, and he was repeating that story. They only had a way to express that he himself saw Jesus say something, and then he was telling them that. So they couldn't do more than like 1 degree of separation away.
What language was that? Do you know what it was called?
Let me look this up. It's so fascinating, and it made linguists so angry at the time because it violated a lot of the understood things in linguistics of like, you have to have this and this, or you can't have a language. I'll find it. Sure. Give me a second.
On the side note, Addy, on the subject of putting 2 engines together, just look up tractor pull unlimited class, and you'll see all kinds of tractors that just put on like 5 V12 engines, or hook up like 4 Chinook helicopter jet engines together, or
yeah, I've seen this. Yeah,
ridiculous.
The Paraha language in Portugal.
Paraha. Okay.
And there's this book on it called How Language Began. I believe that's the name of the book. Let me double check that real quick here. Yeah, How Language Began is by the guy who was the missionary that turned into a linguist, Daniel Everett.
Interesting. All right. Huh.
And here it is. Yeah, it lacks a hierarchical grammar, meaning you can't create abstractions or words that sort of mean this set of other words. And it lacks a clear noun-verb distinction, and that made linguists very, very angry.
And it's the grammar that's limiting this.
yeah, like the rules of the language limit what they can talk about, but they had, you know, a fully functioning society that only spoke this language. So clearly the language works through things. Right? You can argue about whether that society could build a spaceship or whatever, but like, you know, they had a society that had persisted for thousands of years that didn't need hierarchical grammar, which violates a lot of assumptions everybody has about language.
I'd then be interested in the evolution of grammar itself. If that's sort of the structure that's dictating how the language is iterating on itself, then what happens if the grammar is able to change itself? I mean, then you could then say as well, is that technically still the same language? But then I feel like, is that not a ship of Theseus thing or whatever?
Yeah, I guess so. Although, that's interesting.
Yeah. Nicholas, you've been pretty quiet. Do you have any thoughts?
I've just been in and out with thoughts with the ship of Theseus, especially. I feel like that's kind of exactly it in a way. But I don't really have more to add right now because my brain's kind of tired.
Gotcha. I know you've been pretty hard at work, and you're going to be working more to prep everything for the augmentation lab thing, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be a good payoff though. I think
I'm
that'll
still
be
editing
just-
my paper a little here and there, so
Are you participating in the Aug Lab?
yes.
Dugan, you have to as well. I have to message you about that.
Yeah.
Real quick, DVZ, what you should talk about as we wrap up. I guess the university is highlighting you, aren't they?
Yeah, they're highlighting both me and you, Addy. So yeah, the university is doing a press release because Addy and I both got a grant from O'Shaughnessy Ventures for $10,000, and then we're both presenting at the Augmentation Lab Summit at MIT, which you also are, Nicholas. And so, yeah, lots of exciting things are going on, and this type of stuff doesn't happen at FAU too often. So they're very excited about us.
Cool. All right, y'all. Pleasure as always having these salons, these conversations. Open ideation, as you'd call it. Michael Ostroff, I love math. Yes, I love math. Math is cool. I'll catch you all for the next one. And real quick, I'll put the Aug Lab link in the chat. But please make sure everyone, if you want to come, you have the opportunity to present your research, your projects, your ideas, even if it's in the arts. Actually, especially if it's in the arts, you get a chance to present it with a bunch of very receptive, similar-minded people. You'll find a very good sense of community. I think, Al, what you found at the Wolfram Institute, you'll get a very similar thing also at this kind of event, especially since Stephen is probably going to end up coming as well. Yeah, I urge all of you to apply to come to the event. And if hotels and flights or whatever are, if you have financial limitations and you may not be able to do that, talk to me and maybe we might be able to figure out something. But just apply and then come to me if you have any questions. Okay.
Sure thing.
Perfect. See you guys.
Everybody.
Peace. Thanks as always.